From my blood come the prince that was promised, and his will be the song of ice and fire.
Of the twins himself. Even then Walder Frey was far more worried by his visit than suspicious about it. As for the rest of the weasels in the Great Hall, they were too fearful to catch his eye. Demon almost wishing to growl at them or shout loudly just to see if he could make them scurry off to whatever holes they named as their own. Instead, he simply stood almost 8 foot of him and listened as Walder Frey, a man known for his irascibility and irreverence, was anything but as he spoke to him. The Lord of the Twins showing more deference to the mountain that rides than he perhaps had to any man who had entered his hall in many a year. "Sir Gregor, it's a pleasure to have you in my halls," Walder said, his Weasley voice grating on Demon almost immediately. "The prisoners," Demon said, his voice booming, and he wondered how anyone had ever conversed with the mountain, as he'd not intended for it to be so loud. "I'll see you're brought to them, however. Would you not prefer some refreshments first, Sir Gregor?" Walder asked, nodding to a girl who seemed terrified as she moved in front of the man. He got was the mountain while bearing a tray with a jug of ale and a wedge of cheese. Reaching out to take each from her, he could see how her hands shook, and were it not for him grabbing the tray with his own, then she'd have dropped it to the floor. He ate the wedge of cheese in one bite, drinking down the ale in 2 large swallows, and gave Walder Frey a nod of his head which actually brought a smile to the old weasel's face. Then he was escorted to a large room by one of the Freys along with some serving girls. Again not being looked at with any great degree of observation, their fear not allowing them to do so lest they caught his eye. "Your rooms, Sir Gregor," the Frey with him said nervously, and Demon grunted. "Prisoners," he said, his voice sounding even louder in the small corridor he was in, a corridor made much smaller by the fact that he took up most of it. At once Sir, the Frey said, and as the serving girls ran off relieved to be able to do so, the weasel then led him down to the depths of the keep. The stench was overpowering, it was badly lit and damp, and he had to bend his head more than once just so he could walk through to where the cells were. Damon grunting out his annoyance and almost scaring the piss out of the Frey who was with him. After the man called for one of the guards, he himself moved back so that Demon now had a new escort. No doubt feeling great relief at doing so, and again Demon wondered if the mountain's reputation extended to killing or harming so-called allies as well as enemies. Had he known for sure it did, then he may have made an example of the Frey who'd served as his escort simply for that reason alone. "Sir Mark Piper," the guard said as he opened a door, and Demon saw the young man scurry to the back of the cell, weakened and filthy that he was. "The so-called Great Djinn," the guard said with a cackling laugh when he brought him to the next cell. Demon looking at the large man and seeing that he was far lesser than he once was, though still fierce and dangerous, given that the guard didn't set foot into the cell when he did. Stepping back out of the cell, he was stunned to find that was it. There were no more prisoners for him to see. It confused him for a moment, thinking that there had to be, and then as he got more and more about it, he realized that the answers he sought, or the road to those answers, stood next to him. Others. He growled loudly, and as he glared at the guard he saw the man take a step backward. This is all there is, Sir Gregor. Malister was used to break the siege of Sigurd, and is held in his father's keep, while Edmure Tully has been taken to River Run to break its own siege. The guard stuttered. 4. He questioned loudly. "Some didn't make it, sir. They passed long before now," the guard said, not looking to him, and Demon grunted again. When he turned to leave the cells and began to walk back up the steps, he knew he had left a relieved man behind. He had hoped for more. Edmure Tully would have been most helpful, but he knew where he was now, and should the need arise to get to him, he could. Mark Piper would no doubt be welcomed back by his father, and truth be told, the Great Djinn was truly the prize he sought. Though he was not his only reason for coming here. He was escorted back to his room, and though he wished to remove the face he wore, he knew for now he could not. Demon doubted that word would not reach even the twins about what happened in King's Landing. Were he to be forced to place a wager, then he'd say a raven was already on its way to Tywin to ask why he'd be sent here. Given the news the guard had given him about Edmure Tully, he now had an even bigger reason for his arrival, or at least one that would please Walder Frey, he imagined. The knock that came to his door surprised him, Demon having expected them to leave him alone given how frightened they were when in his presence. Opening it, he found a young man who showed all of that worry and fear as he informed him that dinner was to be served. Demon grunting at the man and finding himself thankful that the mountain was a man of few words. He made his own way to the great hall, and once he entered it he was bid to join Walder at his table, which he did. They were less than halfway through the meal when Walder asked him the reason for his arrival. "My lord wanted eyes on the prisoners," he grunted. "Lord Tywin has nothing to fear, they're well held," Walder said nervously. "My lord asks, I do," he said, and Walder nodded before looking at him curiously. "Has he asked anything else of you, sire?" Walder inquired eagerly. "River Run. He wishes the siege broken. I've sent my son and heir to break the siege," Walder said proudly, which was Demon not already performing a mummery may have made him break character so he could laugh for true. Demon said as he drank down another jug of ale and thanked the many-faced god for the magic that allowed him to do so. "Though of course having a man of your experience offering aid would be most welcome, Sir Gregor, most welcome indeed," Walder said, and while it was appeasing there was truth in his words as well. "Prisoners," he said, and Walder looked at him confusedly. "Only two," he added, and Walder chuckled, almost making him slit the weasel's throat just for the audacity of doing so in his presence. "Weak men. I tried to keep them alive, believe me. But they were weak men, and we were left with but a few," Walder said, and Demon nodded. He was glad to go to his bed that night, and the next day he began his work. Ser Gars Goodbrick was his first, Demon catching the man in the privy and slitting his throat before taking his face and dropping his body down into the ship hole. Ser Tytos Frey he killed later that day, the knife he drove into the side of his head, ending him far more quickly than he deserved. On and on it went for 3 days. He would eat and drink with Walder Frey and outstay his welcome, while one by one he killed any Frey that played a part in the Red Wedding. Ser Lesenhay was found dead in his bed, the night making the mistake of visiting the twins while Demon was there. On the day the Raven arrived from King's Landing bearing the news that Gregor Clegane was dead and the keep was put on full alert, Demon was already wearing a new face. This one was of Black Walder Frey. Another who made the mistake of arriving at River Run while he was there and thereby shortening his life by weeks or perhaps moons. It was a most fortuitous kill in the end, as it was he that Walder placed in charge of righting the keep and finding the impostor. All had got was the mountain that rides. Using Black Walder's face, Demon killed Ser Waylon Frey. The man getting a far more gruesome death than Demon had intended when he bragged about his part in killing Robb Stark's direwolf. Demon taking his head and placing it on a spike for all to see and be fearful about. He was called to Walder's rooms that day, and he almost took him right there and then, only the need to make the man suffer stopping him from doing so. Instead, he took his anger out on a man who deserved it just as much. Ser Raymond Frey he left bloody and dying alone in a dark room where he knew it would be hours until he passed. The man had killed a mother, and the many-faced god had wished him to suffer as much as Demon did. There were others that played minor parts, yet it was those not here that he thought about: Ser Rhyme and Ser Walder Rivers and more. The time though had come to leave this place. His stay had been more than long enough, even though he could have spent moons ending them one by one or done for them all in one fell swoop. There was only one more name on his list for now, and after today Walder Frey would be more. He made his way to the weasel's room, heard the sounds of the girl crying as she was taken by her husband, and when he entered the room and dragged the old lech off of her, he could see her smile. It was not one she wore for long, as Damon took his knife and with a hand over Walder's mouth, he then took the weasel's cock before jamming it down Walder's throat. "The Starks send their regards," he said as he held the knife under Walder's chin and drove it deep into his skull while he choked on his own severed member. There were no screams from the girl. Tears fell, but there were no screams, and Demon wondered if it was because he wore Black Walder's face, or was it simply that she hated what her husband did to her that much. With a finger to his lips and a nod of her head, he moved and walked from the room. Locking the door behind him, he then made his way to the cells and handed the note to the guard, who took it and nodded. An hour later he and 10 men rode out of the twins with their prisoners. The Grachan looking to the sky and finding the light to be something he could barely bear, while Ser Mark Piper wept openly when he saw the sun. That night they camped, and the men with him made merry while the Grachan and Mark were tied to a tree. Demon waited until most were asleep before he went about his work. 2 guards he killed while they were awake, and the other 8 men all made their way to the many-faced gods as they dreamt of who cared what. Please, please don't, Sir Mark said as Damon moved to him, and it took him a moment to realize that he still wore Black Walder's face, and that this was not perhaps out of character for the man to do. Be not alarmed by what you see, he said to the two men, and then turned away from them to remove the weasel's face, turning back now wearing his own and seeing Sir Mark move as far away from him as he could, while the Gretchen looked at him more curiously, and it was he who spoke. Who are you? The Gretchen asked, when most men may have asked him what was he. A friend of the North's Lord Umber. Here to see you both return to your families and to offer you the chance of justice and vengeance, he said, and the Gretchen smiled a smile that would chill the hearts of men that were not he. Bravos 300 AC. Arya Stark. She was bored. The waif was doing training that she was not allowed to take part in. Hot Pie was busy working in the tavern, and she was not allowed to visit there today for some reason. Where the stupid bull had gotten to she had no idea, and so it left her with little to do but think, and she hated being alone with her gods. Whenever she was, they would inevitably go to her family and to those she now knew that she'd never see again. Rob, her mother, her father, they'd all fallen, and while she had been told that Bran, Rickon and Sansa lived still, she feared she'd not see them either. Surely she'd stayed here long enough, and it was safe for her to go home. There was no way the Lannisters could still be running the realm after all they'd done, wasn't there? She feared there was, that when she was told that they were the reason it was not safe for her to go back to Westeros, it wasn't just a tale she was being told. They, along with the Boltons, would see her dead, or worse, was what Jaqen would say, and though she couldn't play the game of faces that he and the waif could, she felt he spoke truly. She hoped he did. For his words brought not just the hope that she'd be reunited with her family one day, but that those who'd harmed them, betrayed them, and had taken them from her, would all soon face their own punishments. That they had been found guilty and judged by the many-faced God, and that the God of death had sent someone forth to bring the gift to all of them. There was a time when she didn't know what the gift was, and Jaqen's words had confused her. That time was long since past. Sitting alone in her room in the House of Black and White, Arya got back to a little girl who made a list, and though she smiled knowing some of the names were gone, she shivered as she remembered the girl who'd named them. Harrenhal, almost 2 years earlier. Lys had hit her again, and she still felt the sting of the slap, and bore the mark as she moved through the keep. Gendry she could see working in the smiths, and where Hot Pie was she knew not. Arya bumping into and almost knocking over Ser Wylis Manderley as her attention was elsewhere. The heir of White Harbor was a shadow of the man he used to be, begging for scraps of food, and having lost more than 2/3 of his body weight. Whether it was her dirty clothing, her short hair, or his own worries, he'd never recognized her for who she truly was, thankfully. Scurrying away from him, she searched for the man she truly sought out, not finding Jaqen anywhere. It wasn't until later that night that she saw him, and he came to her rather than she to him. Arya was relieved to see him hale and hearty, and yet angry at him for leaving her alone for more than a moon. He caught her glaring at him, and she saw the half-smile that appeared on his face, a smile she truly wished to wipe from it. A girl is angry. Good anger is no bad thing to have. But it must be used right and directed at those more deserving than a man. Jaqen said, and Arya felt her annoyance at him recede as she recited her list in her head. Where were you? I could have. I almost. She set her lip quivering. A man had things to do before he could free a girl. Things now done. Jaqen said, and Arya felt her chest tighten, wondering, hoping that what she thought was what he truly meant. You can. You will. She asked nervously. Tonight a girl and a man will leave this place. We shall take a journey together, you and me. Far from lions and those that are worse than they. Jaqen said, and Arya felt her heart race, before then feeling worried. You and I, only? She asked, and Jaqen nodded. A man owes a girl her freedom. A girl has friends. She said, and saw Jaqen scowl. Friends she will not leave. She said determinedly. The next few moments were silent, and she feared she's asked for too much, and that she'd ruined her one chance to get out of here. When Jaqen nodded, she almost ran and hugged him, only the sound of the footsteps of guards stopping her from doing so as both she and Jaqen went their separate ways. It was 2 more hours later, as she was eating the pitiful meal that she was given, when she saw him again. Jaqen standing with the other guards as Lys moved amongst them and looked her way more than once. When he passed her by, Jaqen stepped closer and whispered Arya, feeling herself grow excited by the words he spoke. A girl will be at the north gate at the hour of the bath. Jaqen said, and then was gone from her sight so quickly it was as if he had not been there at all. Gendry moved with her as soon as she spoke to him later that night. Hot Pie needing to be convinced as he worried they'd be caught. Eventually, though her words and Gendry's convinced him and he moved with them, Arya was shocked to find no guards barring their way as they moved through the keep. Just like earlier, she bumped into Ser Wylis Manderloo, and when he went to speak she placed a hand on his mouth to quieten him. "Do you want to leave this place?" she asked, and he nodded vigorously. "Be quiet and follow," she said, and they moved towards the north gate. No one stopped them, and as she looked to the battlements it looked to her as if the guards were sleeping. Stepping outside the gate she was relieved to see Jaqen waiting for them. They moved quickly and were soon a fair distance from the keep. Jaqen leading them to a small stream where 4 horses were tied up, and when he reached out to one of them and took out the loaves of bread that he then handed to her, she and the others devoured them hungrily. "Eat, and then a man will take you from here. We have many miles to travel before we're safe," Jaqen said, and Arya told the others to do as he said, not that she needed to. It was the next night that they reached the small boat that would take them to the ship. Ser Wylis asking to be taken to White Harbor, or to River Run, and Jaqen telling him that he would not. Arya listened as he told them that were he to do so they would all be dead within the moon, and that he had not saved their lives just to see them given up so easily. A man has a purpose, and is a servant to his God. This is not the end of your journey, and a man asks you to trust that the end he seeks for you is the same as the one you seek for yourselves, Jaqen said, looking to each of them. Arya was the first to climb into the boat, much though she wished to see her brother and mother again. She was not the same girl who'd left King's Landing all those moons ago thinking that Yorn would see her safe. There was no safety on land, and they were still far too close to Harrenhal and the horrors that place had to offer. Gendry, Hot Pie and finally Ser Wylis all climbed in after her, and then Jaqen let the horses loose and joined them. The boat was quickly rowed away from the shore, and soon she couldn't even see it from where she sat. They were given more bread, some meat which was eaten even hungrier than the bread was, as she didn't know the last time she'd been given meat that wasn't a rat or something worse. When she saw the ship she almost gave in to the tears that threatened to fall, instead waiting until she was in her bed and the others were asleep to do so. Finding out that it was to Braavos they were going surprised her, and yet she almost yearned for the adventure it may bring. While she hated that she was moving further away from her family, she welcomed that she was safe and could go to bed without fear. 2 days into the journey she found herself alone on deck with Jaqen. Ser Wylis had earlier argued with him about going to White Harbor and how his father would see them all safe, and Jaqen had just said, not from the Lannisters or Boltons he would not. When Wylis said that the Boltons were on the side of the north, Jaqen had just responded with an ominous "Are they?" It was the same answer almost that he gave the night when he asked why he'd not seen the other Nordmen freed as well as him. With Arya though, he told more of the truth, or what she believed to be the truth anyway. A man was sent to see a girl safe, though he knew it not, Jaqen said, and Arya looked at him curiously. Why? Why does a man care for a girl? She asked, and Jaqen smirked. A man does not, but knows a man who does, Jaqen said cryptically. Why does this man care for a girl? Arya asked. Because he is her blood, Jaqen said, and though she asked him to explain it more, he would not, and so she asked different questions. What of my family? A man can only tell a girl what he knows, and the words are hard, and will cause a girl upset, Jaqen said, and Arya felt his tone was sad, or as sad as it ever got. Tell me, she said worriedly. She cried herself to sleep that night, in front of both Gendry and Hot Pie she cried, and felt no shame for doing so. By the time they reached Braavos though she was more sullen than sad, angry rather than mournful. The only thing that stopped her from giving in to that anger completely was the other thing that Jaqen had said. The many-faced God has his own list. Those who harmed a girl's family are all on that list, and a man has been sent out to see each name is crossed off it. A man who shares blood with a girl. Now, Gendry woke her up, Arya shaking her head and wondering when it was she had fallen to sleep. She followed him as they made their way to their evening meal, one they mainly shared with the waif and the acolytes. Though tonight it was with both Jaqen and the kindly man in attendance. As she ate she looked at both of them, and each time she did so, she caught them looking at her and speaking to each other. It reminded her of a few moons earlier when they'd done the same to Ser Wylis. Arya not thinking anything of it at the time, but a few days later the knight told her he was departing, and that he was being taken to someone who would see him back to his home. She'd asked to join him and been told she could not, had argued with Jaqen about it only for the kindly man to stop her arguments and tell her it was not yet her time. Now as she looked at them both and saw Jacon's half-smile, she felt the hope rise in her chest that perhaps her time was coming soon. When the meal was finished she, Hot Pie, and Gendry spoke about their day. Arya's one spent reminiscing and sleeping, while Gendry had spent the day looking for work and Hot Pie making bread. They didn't see or hear the waif as she snuck up on them, they never did. Were it not for the loud shriek when Hot Pie felt the hand on his shoulder, they'd perhaps not have even known she was there. Arya tried not to laugh at her friend, truly she did, but in the end she couldn't help it, and it was only the waif bidding her follow that stopped her from going too far. She never asked her why, or where she was bringing her. Arya simply walked after the waif, and was led into the rooms that the kindly man kept for his own. Inside both he and Jaqen sat waiting for her, their eyes looking to her as soon as she entered, and she was bid to take a seat. "The time has come to leave us, child," the kindly man said. "A girl is going home," Jaqen said, and Arya felt the smile long before it appeared on her face. King's Landing 300 AC. Tywin Lannister. As much as he had tried to limit the damage, word of what the mountain had shouted out before he died had spread. He had Pycelle sound out ravens, though even the content, should they be believed, would cause issue. Better though that someone wondered if the mountain being killed in such a way was a sign he was growing weak than believe the words he said in death. He cursed the man, and the man who had taken his life, just as much as he cursed his imp of a son for bringing him into their own. Why couldn't he just accept his fate? Why hadn't he just thrown him into the Sunset Sea years ago? Was he to be the doom of his house? No, he'd not have it. He would slit his damn throat himself before he allowed Tyrion to be the ruin of all he had built. He had things he needed to do, a wedding that needed to be prepared for, and an alliance that needed to be solidified. Despite the wishes of the boy's mother, he would see Tommen and Margaery Tyrell wed. It was more important than ever now. He rose from his bed, and the girl who lay there another thing he would need to take care of. It was one thing to sleep with the whore with Tyrion certain to be dead, quite another to do so with his son walking free in the eyes of gods and men. After dressing and sending Shay on her way, he began to write out his missives for the day and ready to deal with whatever issues came up. At the back of his mind, some were already forcing their way into his thoughts and breaking his concentration. Oberyn Martell and Dorne were amongst the most pressing of them. The Red Viper had said no more about Demon Roger, if that was even the man's name, something that Tywin was now sure it was not. Nor had he brought up more about the words the mountain had shouted out, though he was sure they were on the forefront of all Oberyn's thoughts. He worried about what they would do next, and what form the inevitable retribution would take. For while the Red Viper may be acting placid, the old lion knew far better than most that that was when he was at his most dangerous. He should just kill him, and be done with it, and if it was not for Myrcella then he would. But he couldn't risk his granddaughter's life, and so he would need to deal with that before he could focus on the Viper in his midst. Olenna and the Tyrells would be pacified by another wedding, but he would need to speak to some of the men of the Reach himself. Randall Tarley, Mathis Rowan, Robert Ashford and others were even more tied to the dragons than the Tyrells were, and while they may lie down with lions, they'd not do so if they believed he had ordered the deaths of Elia and her children. "Grand Maester Pycelle, my lord," his guard said, stepping into the room, and Tywin sighed. The old fool had better be bringing him more useful news other than the mountain had no face. It turned out that he did, and after he had left, Tywin sent for both his sons and his brother. Jaime he knew would be useless, but Tyrion had an imp's cleverness, and he would see what his son and heir would not. As he waited for them, and for Keevan, he felt a shiver run down his spine. Tywin pouring himself a glass of wine, which he drank down quickly before they arrived. It was Keevan who did so first. His brother wasn't just loyal, but he was dutiful too. Tyrion then arrived before Jaime, which made Tywin frown, but he remained stoic, and when his other son arrived he handed Tyrion the note to read. "Gregor Clegane has arrived at the Twins," Tyrion said to shakes of the head from both Jaime and Keevan. How is that possible?" Keevan said, still shaking his head. "It's not," Jaime answered. "A faceless man," Tyrion said, and Tywin, had he been looking at him, and not his other son, would have noticed he didn't seem surprised by this. "What?" Jaime asked, confused, and Tywin sighed. "Demon Roger is a faceless man, and now he wears another face," Tyrion said. "That's impossible," Keevan said disbelievingly. "Pycelle informed me a number of days ago that someone had removed the mountain's face," Tywin said, pausing before he continued. "I saw it myself, and got nothing of it, for what care I for a dead fool." His annoyance at the mountain's betrayal was still clear in his voice. But why? Why would a faceless man seek to do this? Jaime asked, and Tywin was annoyed with his son, his other son, and brother, and with himself as he couldn't come up with the reason why. He was about to give in to that annoyance when Tyrion spoke. Perhaps the bigger questions you should be asking, brother mine, is who and what. Who is the faceless man contracted to, and what is his contract? Tyrion said, and Tywin felt that shiver down his spine once again. He didn't eat that night, didn't sleep, and he made sure that Shae was not in his bed. His men had given her a choice: leave with the bag of coin he would give her, or stay and take her chances with a son that he could and would not stop seeking retribution for what she'd said about him. She accepted the coin, though he cared not. Had she turned it down, it would have cost her his life, as he couldn't afford dissension amongst his house, not when they had unknown enemies as well as the known ones. It was supposed to be over with, done. The war was won, and other than a wounded stag who had run to the wall of all places, his enemies were powerless. He should be celebrating his triumphs, and yet his goal in some way seemed further and further away. Tommen would be years away from giving him the heir to the throne and to Casterly Rock. Oberyn had the proof he had always wanted, and now bided his time before he made his move, and someone had hired a faceless man, to what end he knew not. Word had been sent to the twins to see him dead, that no matter what it took, Gregor Clegane, or the man who wore his face, needed to be dealt with, and dealt with immediately. Yet Tywin had no faith in Walder Frey to be man enough to do the job, and even less faith in his brood. So after a restless night, he rose early and sent for some of his men. Tywin giving them an order that on the face of it seemed mad, and yet one whose import was made clear by the reward he offered them. Over the next few days, he arranged Tommen's wedding, and met with Randall Tarley and Mathas Rowan. While he perhaps didn't convince them, he felt they were too fearful to go against him or the Tyrells alone. Within a week he was back to his old self, confident, assured, and master of all he surveyed. Making his way to the small council meeting, he almost hadn't a care in the world, little knowing that his mood and world were soon to be turned upside down. When Barry spoke the words out loud, he looked at him incredulously, though he could see the eunuch seemed as surprised as he and the rest of the small council were by what he'd said. "What do you mean the Golden Company has landed in Westeros?" Tywin said they were the only words that came to mind, and they were worthy of Mace Tyrell himself. Castle Black 300 AC. Melisandre. They had arrived just in time. The wall was in its greatest ever peril, and her king had shown the realm that he was truly the promised prince. Castle Black had already fallen. Most of the Black brothers had been put to the sword. The new Lord Commander had been hung from the gates in warning, but then again Jano's Slint was no Jer Mormont. Why they'd kept so many alive she at first knew not, her king and Ser Davos saying it was to have hostages against the other two castles, and yet she felt not. It was why she'd asked to speak to Mance Rayder herself, and had been given leave to do so. The king beyond the wall wouldn't kneel, and his men wouldn't come to them. She'd seen it in the fires, and had told her king, but Stannis was nothing if not stubborn. He believed that he could break the man's spirit, that what he offered would be enough to do so. Melisandre did not. There was more to the Wildings' reasons for not kneeling than simply pride, though what those reasons were she knew not. With a nod, she dismissed her guards and sat facing the man. The former Black brother, rebel, traitor, and king was not how she'd have pictured him to be. Mance was, for lack of a better word, unremarkable. Slender and yet broad, brown hair that was turning to gray, and eyes that showed wit and intelligence. A man who loved music, and was fiercer even than her king with a sword in hand. A deserter of the Watch who'd united the clans of the free folk, and built the largest army that the North had ever seen. An army that her king had ridden down on both sides of the wall with ease. As she looked at him, she saw he was doing the same to her, both sets of eyes taking in the other before she took her seat opposite him. Stannis Baratheon is the one true king. He is the prince that was promised, Azor Ahai reborn. She said softly to no reply, yet still you'll not kneel. She added, "If I kneel to him, I am no king." "Oh, I know you say he's the one true king, but he's not mine. He'll never be king of the free folk. Will not fight for you, Lady Melisandre. I'd not ask my men to, nor would they listen to me if I did. King, I may be, but only because they know I'll not keel," he said as he looked at her, his brown eyes staring into her red ones. "And what of your boy?" she asked, and Mance smiled. "I love my wife with all I have in me. Before I met her I was not a man who kept to one bed, and since Dala, I've lain with only one woman, her. I trust her to look after my son, and should I be wrong then so be it. Do your worst, I care not," Mance said. the fondness for his wife and son replaced by a resoluteness at the end. You will be burned, man's raider, a gift to my God. Is that the fate you seek for yourself? She asked curiously. All my life I only wished to make my own choices, now at the end of it I'll do the same. I don't want to die, believe me. But better I go to my gods on my feet than hide from them on my knees. Mance said, and she rose to her feet turning to leave the room. You have a part to play, Mance Raider, a part I know not the truth of yet. She said as she left the room. She made her way to the king's quarters. Stannis had taken the Lord Commander's room for himself. Nodding to his guards, she entered without knocking to find Ser Davos and the king looking over messages. Without saying a word she took her seat and waited for them to speak to her. Stannis noticing her first and Davos then making a move to leave the room only to be bid stay by the king. He refused. Stannis said, a statement and not a question, and she nodded her reply. He's a proud man. Davos said softly. He's a damn fool. Stannis growled. Who needs to meet his end in the flames? She said, and saw Davos's little shudder. So be it, Ser Davos, you have your orders. Stannis said, and Davos bowed slightly. Your grace. My lady. Davos said before he then walked from the room leaving her alone with the king. There were no words spoken for a few moments, Stannis standing at his desk and looking down at her and at the messages strewn across it. From Bear Island. Stannis said eventually, handing her the scroll which she read to herself. Bear Island knows no king but the king in the north whose name is Stark. Lyanna Mormont. A child mocks me. Stannis said grinding his teeth. Others have declared, have they not? She asked and Stannis nodded. I had hoped to name the free folk mine own, poorly equipped and ill-disciplined though they are. Fighting men I need, and they would have done. Stannis said, and she rose to her feet and moved to him, her hands touching his face and neck softly. Men will come, my king. You are his chosen, and it is your destiny to be his king? She said as she kissed him deeply. The knock on the door stopped it from going any further, and she had to admire her king's resolve. How he managed to not sound more annoyed than he did when Ser Justin entered the room she knew not. She had no interest in what the knight had to say, and so made her way to her own rooms, taking a seat and looking into the flames as soon as she got there. It was strange things that she saw, things that made no sense, and yet things she was sure that she'd seen before. A man with no face lay down with a red wolf, and behind them marched an army of gold. Lions trembled, roses wilted, snakes slithered, and above them all, a dragon flew high as a wolf howled loudly. She saw Mance Raider lead an army of free folk and descend upon a grey stone castle while flayed men burned in the distance. Beneath a tree wolves lay down and played happily, two grey, one black and one red, while a white one walked towards them and was welcomed by them all. She saw her king wield a fiery blade against an unseen foe, saw a crown on his head, and crowds cheered. Blinking her eyes she saw no more and rose to her feet. It took her some time to find the women, the Wilding Princess, and the Wilding Queen both hovered over the Wilding Prince protectively. It wasn't he that she'd come for, though she sensed the king's blood that flowed within his veins. Instead, it was the Wilding Princess, and it was she who looked at her warily. Melisandre hating that this was always how those who didn't believe reacted to her presence. Your king is to die, and only you and I can see that it not so. She said, and Val looked at her even more warily now. Why would you wish to help Mance? Val asked doubtfully. Because my God wills it so. She replied. White Harbor 300 AC. Wyman Manderley. It had taken a few days for Wylis to return to himself, his problems more mental than physical to Wyman's mind. His son blamed himself for Wendell's death even though he was already a prisoner by the time the Red Wedding had taken place. Wyman believed that had it not been for his wife and girls, maybe even somewhat for him too, and certainly for the fact that he knew justice and vengeance was coming, then he may not have ever been able to recover. Slowly but surely though he did. Each day that he spent with Wanfried, Wyla, and Leona making him remember that he had a reason to live. Physically it would take longer, it had been almost a year since he'd been freed, and yet Wylis was still a shell of the man he'd once been. Not simply because of the amount of weight he'd lost either. His strength, vigor, and drive had all been weakened by what he'd gone through, and his appetite was nowhere near where it should be. Again it would take time, just as it did with his mental and emotional state, and Wyman would see that he had all the time he needed. That he was back was all that mattered to him. He was back and he was safe, and when he finally met the man truly responsible for that, then Wyman would pay him back tenfold. It took a few days for the Company of the Rose to disembark their ships, the sheer amount of men and supplies they brought with them leaving him staggered. These men had come prepared, and the Boltons and the Ironborn would suffer because of it. He waited for the visit of the commander of the Company of the Rose, Jon Snow. Wyman, having learned that most of the men took the bastard name of the North as their own because they too were bastards in some way. Though it was the lack of a homeland rather than a mother wed to a father that named them so. Eventually, Asher Forrester led 4 men into his solar, and Wyman looked upon them with glee. Just like Brandon Snow, Artos, Hugo and Jon Snow were big men, all well over 6 feet, and built like the warriors that they were. Young Asher told me it was ale more than wine that you'd like to wet your tongues with, Wyman said as the ale was poured out into the largest mugs he could find. Aye, long have we wished to taste true northern ale. Jon said as he swallowed a large swallow, and by the look on his face, enjoyed it immensely. I want to thank you again for my son. I'd feared the worst for far too long, and more so I feared what I may resort to in order to see him free. Wyman said to Nods, I know there is more to the tale than he and even Brandon told me. I'd ask to hear the rest, or as much as you'd be willing to speak on. He added as Jon looked to Brandon, who nodded. We serve the White Wolf, the son of Lyanna Stark, and the man who'll see the North righted and that justice is given to those who've fallen. Jon said, and Wyman felt his heart race. Who is this son? Where is he? He asked, though he knew there could only be one father to Lyanna's boy, and words that both Mage Mormont and Howland Reed had said to him many years earlier now began to make more sense. Daemon Targaryen. The Song of Ice and Fire and rightful king of the 7 kingdoms. As for where, he's here and right now is working to see more Northmen free. Brandon Snow said, answering for Jon. How? He asked with a confused look, and so he clarified his question. How did the Lady Lyanna give birth with no one knowing? I know not. Surely her brother noticed her condition when he found her in that accursed tower. All I know is that the boy was taken on the day Eddard Stark arrived at the Tower of Joy, and that had he not been, then the North would be fucked even worse than it has been. Jon said, shaking his head, his annoyance at all that had happened to the North clear. Taken by who? He asked curiously to no reply. You say he's freeing more Northmen, where? How? The Freys have debts to pay, and pay them they will. Those held in their dungeons will be released, and soon return to their homes. Brandon said, and Wyman felt his heart race again. The Greatjin, he knew the Greatjin was held there, though not who else. And the king he will come to? He asked eagerly to a shake of the head. It's not yet time for the White Wolf to return to the North, for now, he has business elsewhere. When he does come back we need to be ready. So what can you tell me about those Leal, and those who are not? Jon asked. It bothered him that Daemon Targaryen wouldn't be coming back to the North just yet, Wyman worrying how long it would be, and even if the boy would travel north. By the sounds of things the Company of the Rose had no plans to launch an all-out attack on the Boltons, and there was Stannis Baratheon to deal with as well. For now, he simply told him of how things were. The Boltons had the Ricewells, Boltons, Haw, Umber, and others allied with them. Some Freys too, his own spies had told him. Stannis had sent word out to some of the northern houses, and while some had answered his call and others had not. House Reed hasn't risen for anyone, nor has House Mormont, and my own men stand ready, and are yours to call upon. Others, should they know of you, and of a Stark living, would rise too. But without the king, we need to get messages to those we can call upon. Ready them for what needs to be done. Can you have some of your men lead some of mine own to Lord Reed? Jon asked, and Wyman nodded. The Mormonts a raven from you in your hand, would it be known to them? He added, and Wyman nodded again. The mountain clans are Leal men, fierce, and would march for any son of Stark. They may march for Stannis simply to shed Bolton blood. Wyman said, and Jon looked to Asher. You'll need to ride and ride hard. Take 50 of our best with you. Explain as much as you can, and get them to hold for now. Jon said, and Asher waited for no second order. The young man leaving the room, and Wyman wouldn't put it past him to be gone from White Harbor by the time this meeting had ended. He turned out to be right in that, and later that night they celebrated the men who'd come to put the North to rights. Though it was not a true feast, it was as close to one as he'd held in many a moon. Wylla seemed to be even more of himself, and his granddaughters were more pleased than they'd been in moons, not just at their father's return but at their guests, and what they may mean to. When Brandon told them that the mountain had fallen, when he then explained to them who it was that had seen him fall, Wyman made everyone in the Merman's court toast the White Wolf. Later, when he heard that the Golden Company had landed, and that it wasn't just the north that Daemon Targaryen intended to see right, Wyman had decided he'd end this night drunk for once. Something he paid for the next morning when he woke with the worst headache he could remember. After he'd broken his fast, he watched as the Company of the Rose departed White Harbor, and then he set about securing the city. Given what he was about to do, he'd imagined the Boltons may seek to stop him. He'd be ready for them, and he smiled at the knowledge they'd not be ready for the Company of the Rose or the White Wolf. The Riverlands and Kingsroad 300 AC. Daemon Targaryen. He knew they wished to ask him questions, and he'd even answer some, but not here and not now. Ser Mark seemed more frightened of him wearing his own face than he had been of him wearing Black Walder's, while the Greatjin seemed more curious than scared. That both men now wielded blades offered them some comfort that they could protect themselves, yet in truth neither of them could. Daemon had no doubt the Greatjin had been a fierce man once and would be so again, for now, he was a shadow of his former self. Ser Mark was not even that, and so after gathering the supplies the Freys brought with them, taking all the horses and the men's coin, they mounted up and they rode hard. It was light when they stopped, and the horses were tired. Daemon changing the ones they'd ride from here and freeing the others as the Greatjin and Ser Mark ate and rested. Both men's appetites were larger than what their stomachs could handle, and he had needed to tell them to go easier on the food lest they harmed themselves more. After they'd eaten and rested, they mounted up again, and they rode once more, this time somewhat more slowly. "Who are you?" the Greatjin asked as Ser Mark looked on warily. "For many years I was no one. A man without a name, a past, a family, or even anything to name mine own. It wasn't until a few years ago that the truth was told to me, and that truth is what led me here today. My name is Daemon Targaryen, trueborn son Prince Rhaegar and Princess Lyanna Targaryen, his second wife." Daemon said to a gasp from Ser Mark and an angry glare though silence from the Greatjin. "You don't believe my words, and were I not the man who rescued me you'd gut me for speaking them aloud," he said to a shocked look from the large Lord of Umber. "Aye, that I would. The woman who you sully by naming yourself as such was a woman who deserves better," the Greatjin said, his anger held in check, be it by fear or because he was indebted to him. "On that, Lord Umber, we can agree. My mother deserved far better," he said, his voice even, though the sadness he felt was real and true. Nothing was said for the next few moments, the Greatjin trying to come up with the questions that he wished him to answer, and Ser Mark surprising both the large man and him by doing so first. "The tale we heard was that Prince Rhaegar kidnapped the lady, that he held her prisoner, and a war was fought to see her free," Ser Mark said, and Daemon nodded. "A fine tale it is too. A man seeking to rescue his betrothed from the evil son of a mad king, and a brother seeking to rescue his sister and avenge his family. I'm sure many songs were written and many a bard earned himself a drink with such nonsense. So believe the tale if you must, or since we've naught else to do on this fine day, mayhap I'll tell you the truth as I know it," he asked, and both men nodded. He waited a few moments gathering his thoughts, and then made ready to tell a tale he'd told only 3 times since it had been told to him a little over 2 years earlier. "My mother and father met at Harrenhal long before he crowned her the Queen of Love and Beauty." He began, his words coming far easier than they once had. "Perhaps you've heard of the Night of the Laughing Tree, and the Mad King's worries about such a night. How he promised great rewards and had all the knights, lords, squires, and servants all seeking the night out so that he could pay back their chivalry only how he could. He spat the last part as he thought of the monster he shared blood with. Aye, though the night was never found," Ser Mark said, almost smiling. "Were they not? Would it surprise you if I told you then that Prince Rhaegar Targaryen found the night himself, that he along with Ser Arthur Dayne did what no one else could?" He asked, a small smile on his face as the horses moved slowly across the ground. "Aye, lad, it would. It's not a tale I've heard," the Greatjin said. "My father found the night as they struggled to remove their armor. Faced with the crown prince and the greatest swordsman that ever lived, what think you the knight did?" he asked, but he answered himself before either of the 2 men could. "You be wrong, for they didn't surrender. My mother was a she-wolf. She-wolves fight, and they don't lie down for gods or men," he said as both men turned to look at him. "Aye, you heard me right. My mother Lyanna Targaryen was the Night of the Laughing Tree. After being faced with some squires beating down one of her father's bannermen, she ran them off and bid him face them in a joust and teach them about honor. But the man was no writer then or now, and so my mother took his place and beat their knights herself." Daemon's pride in her actions was clear in his voice as he spoke. "Honor, I remember hearing the knight called those they beat out for honor. Sir Mark said, and Demon nodded. When my father heard the tale he was, as you can imagine, impressed. Sir Arthur too, as the chivalric code was something that meant much to them both. My mother and father talked, they spoke, became friendly, though nothing happened further between them, not then. But it was for honor that my father crowned my mother, not for lust, and though I cannot say it was for love, mayhap it was already so by then. He said as he contemplated whether or not his father and mother already knew how they felt about each other. The kidnapping, lad, what has this to do with the kidnapping? The Gretchen asked brusquely. You know of the Mad King's master of whispers, no doubt, the current master of whisperers. He asked Hanaud's tasked by the Mad King to find who the knight was, as Ares was unable to let go of a slight real or perceived. He eventually found out it was my mother, and then Ares demanded she lose her head. Were it not for my father, then it would have been my mother's death that lit the flames of war. Instead it was my grandfathers and uncles that did so, he said as he reached down to his pouch and took a large swallow of his water. My father, Sir Arthur Dane, and Sir Oswell went beat the Mad King's men to my mother. They spirited her away for her own protection, and in a forlorn effort to stop Ares' madness from allowing him to commit a crime that Westeros wouldn't forgive or accept. How do you know this, lad? The Gretchen asked. I've read my mother's journal, Lord Umber, my father's letters. I know it as if I lived it, though my own part only came much later. During their travels, my father and mother fell in love, and they fell hard. They married under her gods and his, and it was to Dorne they went to hide out until my father could gather the resources to remove Ares from the throne. Demon said, and his sadness here came across in his words, voice, and expression. Alas, fate and the gods had other plans. You're saying Brandon Stark was killed for naught, that we rose for naught? The Gretchen asked angrily. How are you here, Demon? Your mother and father, the King's Guard, how is it you are here? Sir Mark asked, and it was him rather than the Gretchen he answered first. On the day I was born, as the King's Guard fought against 7 men of the north, my uncle included, a man spirited in and took from the Tower of Joy to Braavos. For years I've been trained by that man and by others, trained to do things that you saw some of a little earlier. Had he not, then my life would have been much worse and much different, and my uncle would have seen that I was in no position to offer the aid I'm now able to. Demon said, and the Gretchen looked at him, his eyes full of fire, as he got ready to explode, and when it came it was just as he expected. You sully Lyanna Stark's name, and now Ned's. I'll not have it, boy. I may not be as fit and healthy as I should be, but I'm still man enough to end you. The Gretchen said, and as bluster when it wasn't bad. The mountain thought likewise. Lord Umber, guess where he is now? He said as he turned away from the 2 men before turning back and facing them both, the Gretchen falling off his horse as he saw the mountain's face, and as Demon stared at him and spoke, still think you're man enough? He asked, his voice not his own, and the booming growl ringing out in the quietness that they rode in. Since they were near a stream, he felt it was a good place to stop and refill their water pouches. They still had miles to travel before they were done, and he wished to give both the Gretchen and Sir Mark time to get used to all that he'd said. He closed his eyes, and he was back in the house of black and white for a moment. The waif, and he trading blows as he moved in the shadows. He was playing the game of faces with the kindly man and Jakin, and eating with the other acolytes. In the blink of an eye, it was all gone, and he was riding with his aunt and the Dothraki, speaking to a mummer dragon and standing in front of the company of the Rose as he fulfilled their prophecy and bid them come home. Say I believe you. What happens now? The Gretchen asked as they stood by the stream. The north is owned by the Boltons, Lord Umber. They and their allies have profited well from the Red Wedding and your imprisonment. At the wall, Stannis Baratheon tries in vain to gather a wilding army so he can take them on, and in King's Landing Tywin Lannister tries to stop whispers of his part in the deaths of Princess Elia, Prince Aegon and Princess Rhaenys from becoming shouts. The Tyrells wrap their vines around a king and a throne, and only one of them I care about. He said with a smirk. You mean to be king? Sir Mark asked. Better me than those I mentioned, no. He said with a chuckle, while the flayed men think they sit comfortably on the winter throne, they do not. My own men, along with the northern allies that I've brought to my side, all make ready our move. In the Stormlands, the Golden Company waits to lure lions and roses out to play, and in King's Landing a viper bides his time, until he brings the snakes to bear. Demon said, and then noticed the surprise on both men's faces. You got I came alone? He asked, making a jape of it. The 2 men looked at him, both eager to hear more, and so he bid them mount up, and they began to ride again. It took them a little over a week to reach the Trident, Demon spending the first night there just looking into the waters where his father met his end and wishing he had it in his power to turn back time or travel through it. His two travel companions had gotten more comfortable with him. The Gretchen was relishing the idea of getting back at lions and flayed men, and Ser Mark having come on greatly just from being fed regularly. He told them some of the things he'd done in Essos, more of the things he'd done since arriving in Westeros. When he told them that he'd killed Joffrey Waters, both men had been shocked, the Gretchen laughing loudly and patting him on the back when he told him that it had been the Boy King who'd decided Ned Stark's fate and no one else. The tale of facing off against the mountain and getting him to confess was another favorite of the Gretchens, though the man was happier to hear about his cousin and Ser Wylis than anything else. As he was when Demon told him where they were going, and where he from there would be traveling to. Ser Mark too was more than happy to find that it was to the north he was heading, the knight understanding that much as he'd like to travel to Pink Maiden, he could not. It would be a raven that carried the news to his father of his freeing, and for now, that would have to do. When they reached Maidenpool, it took him some time to find a ship that was heading north, and even then it was to Guttown rather than to White Harbor that it was heading. Demon taking it as a sign as he looked at the names on his mother's list, and as he went to his bed the night the ship set sail, it was with those two names on his lips. Lysa Tully, Petyr Baelish. He whispered as he drifted off to sleep.